chat with you all. So thanks again for being here. We're going to chat for maybe about half an hour or so. Lara's got to play on this concert, and Dave's music is going to be on this concert, so we want to leave a little gap. But that's kind of what we're in for. Thank you both for the extra time.
Pleasure to be here.
Some of the people here know your origin stories in Corvallis, and maybe some less so. But I wonder if you could remind us of those, and then what I'd like to get to eventually is how your paths intersected years later, how Corvallis folks found themselves in the same recording studios in LA, basically. But Lara, could you tell us about your musical starts here and how led you to what you're doing now?
Sure. Well, my musical start was at Sheldon Middle School with Scott James. And I actually always wanted to play the oboe, but I didn't have a lot of luck producing sound on it when I was 11 years old. So I played clarinet at first. So I did that all through middle school. When I went to high school, I went to Crescent Valley. I decided to try oboe for the year, and well, it stuck. So, and I had been in the Corvallis Youth Symphony as a second clarinetist. By 10th grade, I was playing principal oboe. So I got really into the instrument. I studied with Mike Curtis and Annalisa Morton, who are, who have been really key in a lot of musicians who've come out of Corvallis, their careers, because Mike taught basically all the woodwind instruments. So that gave me a lot of valuable experience in orchestral playing, and then I continued at the University of Oregon doing similar work. And then I moved to LA in 2002 to go to Cal Arts, and eventually got a doctorate at USC.
Beautiful. So I started out not knowing anything about music, getting randomly put into a choir class at Highland View Junior High, going into 7th grade. And what I didn't know was my teacher there was a woman named Joyce Eilers, which might ring a bell to some of the Corvallisites here. And so she was a composer, and I was randomly put into this choir class. So sorry. And noticed that she was composing a lot of the music that we were singing. And so that caught my eye kind of, and that first Christmas holiday vacation I went home and did an arrangement of Barbara Ann as a 4-part, the old Janet Dean song, I guess, or Beach Boys did it too, and showed it to her coming back from Christmas, and she thought there was something there, and then so I caught the bug of composition at that point and started writing and arranging through junior high. She was wonderful. She also hooked me up in 9th grade to take my first year of music theory here at Oregon State. And it was, my first semester was a summer deal, and the professor of that class was a guy named Marlon Carlson. I don't know if anybody knows who he is. And I'm deeply indebted to him as well, and I don't know that we've ever talked about this, but you set me up with a listening list of about 20 pieces of the most important classical works, of orchestral works, including Ravel, Stravinsky, and such. And set me up with learning how to go to the music library and check out the records and the scores. And so I spent, I don't know, months going through that listening list, reading the score. As I was listening to music, whenever I'd hear something caught my ear, I would stop and analyze what was making that sound. And so that's essentially how I learned orchestration, was thanks to that listening list, so I'm very appreciative of that. And then high school, switched over to the band program, went to Corvallis High. Harvey Brooks was the director of bands at that point, so I started writing a billion pieces for concert band and jazz band. Then was interested in film music. Star Wars in 1976, I was 16, that's what caught I caught the bug at that point. Went to LA for college, stayed through my 20s, moved back to Salem when our first son was born. I was 30 years old, that's been 36 years ago, I don't remember how old I am now, but lived in Salem for a long, long time, and then a few years ago moved over to Bend, and that's where we are now.
So interesting. So Lara, you ended up in LA. You're right in the center of it all. You were in Salem date at that point, right?
Correct.
And so, and yet you both found your way into this industry that is a specialized small world within the small world of music, right? There's the concert world, there's the free improv experimental world, there's now, of course, video game music, there's all sorts of things, but film music, especially in the years that you both became active, was a particular world. So how did that happen for you from effectively far away, right, a state and a half away? And then Lara, I'd love to hear, you were in the hotbed of it all, and yet that's just one part of the equation, I know. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, it's a miracle is how it happened, honestly. It really is, because when we moved, I was 30 years old, and at that point, I thought I'd given it my shot in LA to try to get into the film business, and I'd done some work. I'd written for the Ice Capades, and I was done music prep, copy work for other composers for that stretch, but I kind of realized I'd given it my shot, and then again, my wife's training was all done, so she was saying, actually, I say this all the time, she said, I'm going back to Oregon with our son, and you can come if you want to. And so I sort of figured, well, okay, I'd give it my shot. So we moved back, but I'd been down there long enough to make the connections that kind of stuck. So I had one guy, Don Harper, who kept hiring me as an orchestrator or when he'd have projects, and that kind of kept me in the loop. And then when I was 37, I got a call from a composer, Don set me up with this other composer, Mark Menchina. He was needing an orchestrator for a movie called Speed 2. Not the good speed, the bad speed. And so then that was my first shot. I was 37. Then Mark and I hit it off. He liked what I was doing, and he then, right when that was done, had been hired by Disney to be the music producer for the Broadway version of The Lion King. And the orchestrator for that project had just dropped out, and he asked if I would step in. And lo and behold, that show is still running, in New York and selling. It's still in the top 3 box office and has 11 companies worldwide, something like that. So that then really reinforced my relationship with Mark. And then from that point on, our next film together, I did every film for about 20 years through Moana with Mark, where I was orchestrating and arranging and ghostwriting a lot of all of the music, not ghostwriting all the music, but doing everything else. And so 20 years, then we did, next film was Tarzan, Phil Collins, Disney Animation, and then it just kind of kept going and building in one of those miracles. I mean, I started out with Miracle, and that's really what it was. That's how it happened for me.
Lara, miracles for you too?
There's been a few. But I should mention that the first film score that I ever recorded was actually done in Corvallis. Actually, no, it was in Adair Village was where we recorded it. A friend of mine, I had several friends who were into filmmaking, and one of them directed a movie called West Ender. I don't know if anybody remembers that. This was in the night. Okay, a few people. Yeah, well, no one knows it too, because he played on it. And the score was composed by one of that group of friends, a guy named Rob Simonson. And I recorded that for him right before I moved to LA, and he was kind of hot on my heels. We both moved down there at the same time. I was going to school, and I think he was just kind of trying to, get his foot in the door for film composing. And it actually ended up being kind of helpful, because when Rob would get work, he would call me. And that helped. And, it wasn't necessarily like the big break that I was waiting for. It was a lot of little things at the beginning, but it helped build my experience. Likewise, I was down there as a student, so I was getting called to play student films and, the odd, Lifetime movie, that kind of thing. Just, really small projects. It would usually just be a couple of woodwind players in a room. Just, sometimes just laying down tracks on top of synthesized music just to make it sound a little more human. But the real miracle occurred when I went to a wedding. It was one of my husband's students. My husband teaches at a private school in North Hollywood. And he had a really brilliant student. And we went to the wedding. It was for one of his colleagues, but when I was at the wedding, I met the father of the student. And I said, oh my gosh, I love your student, your son, he's really great, he's really talented. He was a composer as well. And so I just kind of hit up a conversation with this guy, and he said, what do you do? I said, I play the oboe. I said, what do you do? He says, I produce movies. I said, cool, anything I would have heard of? And he said, Titanic? And he said, give me your card. I thought, okay, you know, this will go nowhere, but I gave him my card, and about 2 weeks later, I got a call to play on Avatar. And that was, a huge, from going from 0 to 100 in 2 seconds, because that was, for a long time, the highest grossing box office movie of all time. I think it was quite a few years before his record was broken. Not usually how you get started. I got a few kind of strange looks from the other woodwind players who knew me, but they knew that I hadn't quite paid my dues to the extent that I should be playing on a movie like that. So it was a really scary experience, but the principal oboe player eventually took kind of a liking to me, and she, her good word was kind of what led to everything that's come since.
So interesting. I wonder if we could unpack a couple of the things that you both just talked about, because they are a little bit specific to that world. So Dave, maybe if you could start and tell us a little bit about the difference as you see it between composing, orchestrating, and arranging. You do all three, and other kinds of music making, right? But those roles are sometimes distinct in this industry, and you've been very active in a lot of them. Certainly there's crossover between them too, right? But could you talk us through a little bit about those roles and about how you've navigated those different kinds of creative work?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of define it, and it's not necessarily all true. There's such a crossover between all those roles that there's not really necessarily a defined thing. And I'm going to talk here about how it works in film music in Hollywood is kind of the perspective I'm going to take here. But sort of starting at the bottom, in a way you would say, it would be the orchestrator. And the orchestrator in today's world, every cue that a composer writes has to be mocked up. So in other words, realized as a synthesized with a computer using samples. And so that, because the director wants to know what the music's going to sound like before they spend the money to go into a studio with the full orchestra. And so, and it's gotten good enough to where you can give a pretty good idea. So an orchestrator in today's world essentially will take the MIDI file, the MIDI information from that computer version of the mock-up, and translate that into the score that then parts will be extracted for the musician. So that's kind of the way that it works. In other areas of the world, like in Broadway, orchestrator is a whole different world, or a different role, more involved. But then an arranger, like the roles that I look at as an arranger that I feel like I work, it's like song arranging. And so, for instance, in a movie like Frozen is a movie that I was the song arranger for. And so then the songs were written by Bobby Lopez and Chris Nanchen Lopez. So then they essentially write a piano part and have vocal demo of them singing the voices of the different characters. And then that comes to me. And so then I take that piano part and I write counter melodies, and I come up with different harmonies every once in a while, and things like that. And I blow it up from just a simple piano part into the full orchestra. That is what you hear in the final product. So that's one way to look at an arranger. Another way that one can work as an arranger is essentially to take the composer's themes, and deadlines are always incredibly tight in the film world. So very few composers are able to actually write all of the music themselves and do all of the, the mock-up or whatever it's going to be. So then an arranger also then might be taking the themes of that, of the composer, and then specifically writing for a cue, a piece of music that the composer doesn't have time to get to or whatever. So that would be another way that the arranger would be. At the top of that pile will be the composer who is writing the melody, and at the minimum is writing the melodies and the basic harmony. And a lot of composers, hopefully will be actually doing the mock-up as well and doing the whole thing. Again, a lot of times people don't have time, so they'll hire other people to realize those mock-ups. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, how it kind of lays out.
And when you say tight timeline, talk us through one of those timelines.
Yeah, and it can vary. So like, again, I had a sort of a semi-career, or a sub-career as a song arranger. So when you're working on a film with a musical, you actually have several years. Like I'm working on a project now that won't be released until November of 2027. but it's already been going on for a year, you know, right? And so, but you can get to these other film projects where you might have 3 weeks from the time that you actually can start writing music to when you're actually hitting the studio to record. So it can be a quite brutal turnaround, and yeah.
So hitting the studio to record, Laura, brings us back to you. So you play on stage, you play with the Pasadena Symphony and other ensembles, but you do a lot of studio work, and that's where your paths eventually cross. But studio playing, particularly in the film industry, is its own animal with its own skill sets and its own kind of expectations. So what's different about that than playing on stage? What's the preparation like? What's the actual execution like? Playing with click tracks, playing with image, playing with people that maybe you've never met before in really consequential situations. How's that been?
Sure, that's a great question. It is a bit different from orchestral playing. For one thing, you don't have to try so hard to project. That's a lot of what we do is like just figuring out how to play loud enough that it will make it to the end of a concert hall. And so that was one of the things that I kind of had to learn was like, oh, actually a lot of the time you're too loud because the microphone is right there and it's very sensitive. So, and likewise, I had to really fine-tune the quiet end of my playing, which oboe is a very dynamically challenged instrument. It doesn't have a really, it's mezzo forte. That's pretty much all it does. So I had to really work hard on learning how to play quietly, which was maybe a little bit of an adjustment to my reed making, but you know, we also sometimes we just stuff things in the bell, or like one of my friends invented this great technique for the English horn where she would put a tote bag on the floor and just put the English horn into the tote bag, because that was one of the only ways to make it play quietly enough. And you know how sometimes you play as quietly as you can and you're like, my God, I've made the quietest sound that has ever been produced on this instrument ever, and in the booth they're like, toss it the English horn. We don't really want it anyway, it's still too loud. So that's a big part of it. The preparation, there is often none, as Dave mentioned, because a lot of times the arrangers and orchestrators are working through the night. We're used to seeing them very bleary-eyed in the morning, and they say the ink is still wet. It often is pretty close to literally still wet, or sometimes we'll get pieces partway through the section that were only finished that morning. Now that said, sometimes we get stuff ahead of time. Now that we live in the age of scanners and PDFs, sometimes we get things emailed to us ahead of time. Whether or not you have time to really practice it just kind of depends on your schedule. You definitely get very good at sight reading, you get very good at winging it. We have amazing copyists who make the parts look incredible, very big and easy to read. In fact, one of the musicians earlier commented on Dave's piece, oh, you got your part blown up. And I said, no, this is just how it is. They are written to be read. And it's actually much easier to sight read studio music than it is orchestral music for me most of the time, just because of the parts looking so beautiful. That was not the case back in the days of, Gone with the Wind and so forth, when everything was just handwritten chicken scratches.
And that's when I started, actually, Gone with the Wind.
Oh.
No, when I did start, honestly, it was all by hand. I was hand
wow.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough that I didn't start my career until after things were pretty well computerized. And then as far as, you said the people are different sometimes, but it does tend to be, I know most of my colleagues by now. I mean, it's a pool that people get called from, but it's actually kind of rare that there's somebody there that I've never seen before.
Are you asked, Laura, to do much in the way of producing and recording at home or in other non-big studio environments?
Yeah, sometimes you go in and record privately. Roxy, could you sit down, huh? My daughter has a lot of energy. Thank you. So sometimes, and then during COVID was when we all really had to learn how to record at home. And that has never really been my forte. I kind of stay away from the the technology side of recording. So when I did go through COVID and had to record things at home, what that meant for me was I put on a mask and went to a friend's studio, and they recorded me from the other side of the glass. So most of the time these days I'm in with the whole orchestra. Sometimes it will be just woodwinds. Sometimes it's strings and woodwinds. There's various combinations depending on how they want to isolate the sounds. Once in a while it'll be just me. It depends very much on the project.
And then Dave, on the other end of the spectrum, because of all the mock-ups you do, I wonder if you could talk us through the evolution of that technology. You know, early days of MIDI, synthesized sound was mostly unsatisfying musically, right? And now, you know, we're at a point with physical modeling synthesis, with sample libraries, where it can be very convincing. And so I imagine that's changed your own home studio practice.
Oh, for sure. And I'm old enough to where I started, again, everything was by hand, you know, but I always have felt I was lucky to be as old as I am and as young as I am. Because I was old enough to have to learn to do everything by hand, and I'm a horrible keyboardist, so I always would write straight from my head to paper, you know, and so that's kind of was my background. But then I was young enough to be at the very beginning of the computer kind of music revolution. So like I had a DX7 right out of the gate, and I had a Atari ST, you know, without a hard drive at all, you know, with, I think it was 1 meg of RAM, you know, in it. So that was my first computer. So I jumped into the computer side really early. I was Finale 1.0, you know, person. And so, really it was Hans Zimmer kind of was the one who sort of changed the world as far as the mock-ups go. Before Hans, you really didn't have to mock up anything. And then, you know, post Hans, you really have to mock up everything. And, but so it was I've always been fascinated by computers too, and so for me it was a pretty natural transition. And I still write, I think one problem, oh boy, we can take up a lot of time here. One problem in today's world is I think people can get reliant on the technology. They don't necessarily have to know the real fundamentals of what makes something sound right, you know, and the acoustics of it all and the physics of it. And that was one benefit I really had, was starting writing with that as a part of what you had to know. So when I write in a mock-up, I write it exactly as how I would orchestrate it for real players. And I think that kind of helps because it really plays that way. Then when you actually do get the real orchestra there, then it's not like, a lot of composers will write just a string patch, right? And leave it to the orchestrator to kind of sort out what's going to be what, you know, what thing. But I write I have a violin 1 track, a violin 2 track, viola track, cello track, bass track. I write exactly in my sequence how it's going to be orchestrated, or how I'm going to orchestrate it when it gets to the score. And I think that makes a big difference. But I will say that as good as the samples are, there still ain't nothing like the real thing. I mean, it's really, when you get to that orchestra, it just brings so much life. And I am so thankful to have the opportunity to work with musicians like this. And I'm going to say too, there are times when I'm writing something and I'm going, this is like too hard. They aren't going to be able to play this, you know, especially in the amount of time that we have to put it together. And I've never once come out of it and said, you know, that it wasn't satisfying. It's just stunning what the musicians do. They're so good at sight reading and at putting together the music so quickly and have it sound so great. And so I'm just so fortunate to have the opportunity to have I don't have to live in a mock-up world, right? I get to enjoy the cream of the crop, the best of the best, and very, very lucky.
Well, on the flip side of that, the way that Dave writes, he actually writes for the instruments, and he knows the instruments, so when we get them, the parts tend to be playable. That is not always the case of every composer. A lot of them are writing for computers, and it really shows. Musicians love it when Dave's name is on the score. Yes, they really do, because you know how to write for the instruments, and it's idiomatic, and it sounds good, and it's rewarding to play. So that's a big part of why his career is as big as it is. I'm just going to say that, because he would never say that.
Lara, what do you, apart from the frustrating scores that maybe aren't even in the range you should be playing in, what are you experiencing now in terms of what you might see as trends, what you might see as kind of interesting pushing of the envelope musically? Are there things happening in that world that you think are looking forward in interesting ways?
Well, yes, but I'm not sure that I would consider them interesting or positive necessarily. I mean, I think that you would agree with this. There's been a real stepping away from melody in film scores, which has been a really sad thing. It's a lot more just kind of color and
I call it wallpaper.
yeah, and it's really not fun to play either. I have to say. It's so there's been that. There's unfortunately, there's not as many composers who really like to write for woodwinds anymore, and that's been very sad because they do have such good potential for color. But I actually think that, especially in the case of the oboe, the mock-ups are a big part of that because the electronic version of the oboe really doesn't sound good. So the directors hear the mock-ups and they say, "Get that out of there." So we end up out of work sometimes. It tends to be a lot for strings and brass. And percussion, I'm sad to say, is getting replaced by samples really rapidly because they're very expensive. So for films that have budget constraints, that's one of the first things to go. I'm sure you've had to fight hard to get live players.
Yeah, and it kind of depends. I mean, there's some, I'm kind of lucky that most of the projects are pretty well funded or whatever, so I don't really usually have to fight too much, but I do know it's a huge deal. And
Yeah, I mean, I know this partly just from my work with my union. I've had a lot of percussionists come to me and say, help us, because we're dying here. We're just not getting put on things anymore.
Can I jump in real quick too? I'm going to say that Lara is not only stunningly incredible oboist, as you're going to hear, musicians, but she's also hugely responsible in the RMALA. You're the president of RMALA. And
I drew the short straw.
Yeah. But she knows everything about all of the labor side of this business too, and is just fantastic in that role as well. So we're very fortunate in multiple ways to have you, many ways to have.
Oh, well, thank you. It's not my favorite part of the job, but it's something that I've just always felt it's really necessary. I mean, as you know, live musicians know this too. I mean, we'd love it if just playing the instrument and making music was the whole job, but it's not. There's so much that's money, and there's a lot. We're always fighting budgets and things getting trimmed, and really fighting to get to make our art, and that's unfortunate. And it's hard enough when you're dealing with the board of a symphony orchestra, but it's really hard when you're dealing with the studios because they are money makers. That is what they do, and especially they have. The people at the top, they see the artistic value of it, but they also have a whole team of lawyers and accountants who are trying to squeeze every little last drop out of every penny. So it's a really challenging part of it, and it's complicated, and it's really not that fun. I'm not sure how much longer I'm going to do it because it's kind of exhausting. But thank you for those kind words.
Two more questions, and then we'll let you get backstage and get warmed up again. But you also play a lot of live music. You play in the Pasadena Symphony, and I wonder if you could talk about your, as you've done more and more studio work, what still brings you joy from playing live with other people and for an audience?
Pretty much what you just said, playing with other people, playing, of course, for an audience. I mean, during COVID, it was so nice that we didn't need an audience because audiences were forced to stay at home, so that was a wonderful thing. We got to keep working a little bit because we had the virtue of not having an audience. But of course, it's wonderful to have people there, to hear applause, to get feedback afterwards. But also, it's such a different approach. When we work in the studios, we're often just recording a few seconds at a time, or we'll record certain lines and fill in the other ones later. Playing in the orchestras is what I do to keep my chops in shape. I wouldn't be able to do the work that I do in the studios if I didn't do my orchestras. And I think that a lot of people feel like that. I mean, it used to be, partly no one can make a full-time living doing anything anymore, so you have to piece it together. But maybe, back in the day, there were people who did studio music full-time. But I would find that very challenging. I really would. I feel like I need to be in the concert hall in order to be the best musician that I can be.
I'd also say it was a different time too, right? I mean, the music that was being recorded in the studios was different than it is nowadays too. So you could really get a rewarding career, I think, if you were just a studio cat, you know, back in the day, that you might not be able to too.
And then Dave, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about this piece we're going to hear this afternoon.
Wow. I'm honestly really, really excited about it because it's a chance to write, it was a chance to write music for music's sake, right? Because for so many decades now, I've just kind of been a commercial musician, right? And so to have, be offered the opportunity to write a piece for this group was really, really exciting for me. And I'm very thankful for Noah back there for reaching out to me. That was very, very cool, yeah. When it was called, it was like, I wasn't quite sure, you know, well, is this something, you know, that I really should be doing or not, you know, and I'll tell you, it's probably about the hardest piece of music I've written for a long, long time because, you know, when you're working on a film, you're led by the visual and the picture, or you have a director telling you, you know, I need you to do this here or whatever. And so to have a literal, clear, blank page was a little bit, whoa. And it took me a while to kind of find my sea legs, as it were. But I went down a couple paths and then eventually found, you know, the realization that really, what is this piece to me? It's a chance to write about Corvallis, right? And I found that was my inspiration, was kind of my experiences growing up, Corvallis is just an incredible city, you know, and I am so thankful to have been able to have grown up here because there are not many places like this, and so I just use the city as an inspiration and friends growing up and things like that. And it was a really, I don't know, I hope people like it. It was fun for me.
And I say, when you listen to Dave's piece, listen for the colors. Because a lot of composers are not great orchestrators, but of course Dave is a great orchestrator. That's kind of how he got his start. And so it's amazing the choices of instruments, the combinations of instruments, and how many different sounds he can get out of a small ensemble. Also, I want to tell the story about how we met. It's a cute story. Yeah, it's a cute story. So I had been, fairly early on in my career, I was hired to play a live performance for songs from Frozen, featuring the original cast. It wasn't for a big a concert hall. It was for a little place in Beverly Hills.
Yeah, for Broadway, wasn't it? I think, yeah, it's like a little jazz club that they'd rented out.
Yeah, so it was, I'm not exactly sure, the audience must have been very hand-picked.
It was all people who had worked on the film or all studio executives. It was a celebration of, did you say Frozen already?
Frozen, yeah.
Yeah. So it was a celebration of Frozen, just it had been kind of a hit. And so John Lasser wanted to like do a thing, so.
And it was a very small ensemble, and they put our bios in the program, and I just, you know, we have to write our own bios. It always feels incredibly awkward, but I mentioned I was from Corvallis. During the rehearsal, I think before the rehearsal even started, I'm doing my thing, and somebody comes over to me with the biggest smile that you've ever seen. You're from Corvallis? I'm from Corvallis too. And I said, no way. So we ended up just talking and hit it off right away. And, you know, I learned more about who he is and the huge projects that he's worked on, and just realized that it was a really special opportunity and a wonderful thing that we had in common. And we always, you know, every time we're working on a project together, we always get together and kind of, you know, geek out a little bit about Corvallis. And Andrew Duckles will be there too a lot of the time. And I don't know, the other folks that we've run into over the years.
Yeah, but those are really kind of the thing. So and I would like to just throw in there too that it was, again, your playing this stood out right away. And that was, and so how long had you been kind of in town at that point? Or, because that was like 13, 14 years ago now, I think.
Yeah, I think it was after Avatar, so I was
right.
kind of a semi-regular in the studios, yep. But it was a contractor I'd never worked for before.
Reggie?
Yeah.
You hadn't worked for Reggie before?
No, that was my first time.
Oh wow,
Yeah.
How about that? Yeah, so Reggie though said, like, yeah, you gotta check out this musician, you know, this
Yeah,
player.
he's on the board of the Pasadena Symphony, so I think that's how
And he's a long time, he was Disney's musician contractor for decades and stuff. So anyway, so Reggie recommended you and said, you're great, and indeed you are great. And so from that point on, then, Lara is my first call oboist, I mean, without a question, you know, and so you.
I'll appreciate that.
No, it's, you've earned it, and should be there. So anyway, yeah.
So the other thing that stood out to me about that performance was that Idina Menzel couldn't remember the lyrics to Let It Go.
Right.
It was like every girl in the country was singing that song
Right.
over and over, and she kept, what was it? She kept saying like the snow never bothered me anyway, or something.
Right.
It's like, that's not how it goes.
Right, and the other thing that was kind of wild about that is that, so Tom McDougall, the head of music for Disney, said, oh man, you should conduct this. And I'm not a conductor, you know, I'm not a conductor at all. So I'm sitting there going, I don't know if I should do this at all. I kind of tried to make out of it. And he said, no, you should just do it. And so I was conducting, and it was hard because I then was, and the other thing is Idina, in her defense, right? She had never sung that song all the way through, because when it was recorded, she would only sing like a line and then, you know, do another line. So she never had sung it all the way through at all.
She's also a busy woman.
And she is very busy.
I'm not trying to make fun of
No,
her.
no, no.
It was really fun.
It's really true, but it was like I was the deer in the headlights, because it was like, oh my gosh, what am I gonna do, you know? And so, anyway, that's a great memory. Yeah, very cool.
Thank you both so much. It's a real pleasure. Join me in thanking Lara.